Howdy folks, Moose here. Want to help you with your photography and making autofocus a really essential tool and a very accurate tool for helping you get your story out visually. Because sharpness is everything. You know, the first thing the mind's eye goes to is light and bright. Number two is sharpness. Now that autofocus, there's a lot of questions about it. Everything from what mode to use with what subject and when, and the settings, all of those things, which point blank can be really, really confusing. So all I can really do is to help you is explain how I use autofocus in my photography, which might or might not apply to your photography. I have a lot of friends I shoot with. They use the same setups, the same settings I do. I know the success they have with these settings in their photography, so I'm pretty confident that, at least within the realm in which I'm talking and the settings I'm using, they work really well. Now keep in mind that I'm talking about very specific bodies, very specific firmware. If you don't have those bodies or that firmware, you might not have that setting I'm talking about. You might not experience that autofocus performance that I am. So those are something that's very important. If you're watching this video 5 years from now, a lot of what I'm talking about probably won't apply because it changes quite a bit, sometimes rapidly. So keep that all in mind. You're going to have to do a little bit of thinking on your end, not just blankly take what I have and plug it in and think it's going to work for you. Now, one of the things I'm going to talk about will be the D6, and with its recent firmware upgrade a few months ago, its AF performance has gone through the roof. You might be saying, well, why don't manufacturers just provide firmware and then I don't have to worry about this stuff? Because firmware alone is not what makes autofocus operation possible. A great example is the new Z6 II and Z7 II. To bring that Z6 II up to almost D6 AF performance, they had to literally put in a whole new chip in the camera body. That's hardware, not software. So just making a new firmware is not just possible for some operational upgrades that people want. That's just the way technology works. Now, all that said, why don't we get right into some autofocus basics, and perhaps just start with the basics might help you. So let's start with the basics. I want to remind you that I'm going to be talking about the Nikon D6 and Z6 II. Now the Z6, Z6 II. Those are two bodies that are my primary bodies that I use, and I have figured out for myself the autofocus operation I want to use. Now keep in mind that these bodies have a whole slew of autofocus modes and settings. I don't use them all. I have tested them all, but I know the ones that work for me in my photography, and that's the only ones I can really address in this video, which I'm going to hopefully not make go on forever and ever. I'm going to try to make it as brief and succinct as possible. So when talking about AF basics, I'm talking about some of the things that have to be in play for the autofocus to work. Understand that whatever camera body you have, make sure you have the latest firmware installed. That will get you the best AF performance from any camera body. Now the first thing I'm going to talk about is giving our cameras a stable platform for which to operate. This is essential. If that camera body is moving around, the autofocus won't be able to function. It's literally that simple. It's got to have a stable platform. Whether you're just doing a tripod, long exposure, or you are doing hand holding, which I do the majority of the time, or you have a long lens on a tripod, whatever scenario you are doing, that camera has to be stable. You gotta realize that if you're panning and it's not a smooth line, it goes up and down a little bit, autofocus will have a problem. If at any time you're doing these things and the camera starts searching, you have to say to yourself, at least I do, what am I doing wrong? I do not blame the camera for my autofocus or my focus issues, I have to look at myself, the operator. I'm the one controlling this. It's up to me. So, what does the autofocus need to operate? Start off with very simple. Stable platform. What's next? It needs contrast, a strong vertical diagonal line. Those are the three basic things. If it has that, the actual software, the firmware, all the mechanics click, and the camera can lock onto a subject. Are there exceptions to this? Now there are. A few months ago, there were not. But now with the D6, which I'll show you in a little bit, it has kind of gone past the needing that contrast by some incredible voodoo wizardry that is over my head, but it works, and that's the bottom line. But you have to understand that camera is searching. Stable platform, is it there or not? 2, do you have contrast, a strong vertical diagonal line? Those are the essentials to make it work. What if you have a stable platform? What if you have a strong vertical diagonal line and contrast and the camera is still searching? Next thing you need to look for is heat shimmer. Heat shimmer is something photographers don't tend to think about. Whether you're shooting over snow, water, grass, the desert, blacktop, lots of possibilities. Heat shimmer will cause the autofocus system not to be able to lock onto a subject. This is not some sort of conspiracy. This is not some technological flaw. It is the nature of our cold, heartless bastards, the cameras. They can only do so much. We have to give it the information to operate. It needs these things. How about the simple autofocus continuous and those different kind of modes? Personally, I'm always in autofocus continuous. What's that mean? Well, I put down the shutter release button, I hold it down, and that's activating the camera system, or the back button, I use back button focusing. You activate the system will stay active and constantly look for something to lock onto if you're in AFC. Whether I'm photographing a rock, a tree, a bird, a moose, or a plane, I'm always in autofocus continuous. And my motor drive, it is set to continuous high. I'm giving that camera permission to just rip and work as fast as possible. I'm setting everything up for action. That's important. I'm not setting things up for stills. I'm setting everything for action. Even though I'm photographing possibly just a rock, you never know when that bobcat's going to pop up from behind the rock and say, hello! And you want your cameras operating. You don't want that to stop and change settings. At least I don't want to. All right, now back to that back button for focusing. You got to realize for decades, I was a shutter release active kind of shooter. So in other words, I'm going to partially depress that shutter release. That activates the system, which includes the autofocus. I did that for a long time because I just have a hard time walking and chewing gum, let alone remembering to push 2 buttons on a camera, one to fire it, one to do the focusing. A number of years ago, I finally got to back button focusing. It works really well. That doesn't mean you have to use it. It's just a really good system for a lot of possibilities. Now, another switch you might want to think about is on your Nikon lenses that have an internal motor drive, focusing unit, there is an AM/MA switch on there. Now, I prefer MA. That's because the AM, just a little bit of touch from like a glove in cold weather, it thinks I'm trying to take over and manually focus, and so it won't autofocus. So if you have autofocus issues, you might sit there and put that from AM to MA. Let's talk about one other thing about this whole autofocus basics. You got to understand there are times, a lot of times, I manually focus. I'm old school. I learned manual focus. I didn't start with autofocus. I manually focus quite a bit. Sometimes for critical situations, sometimes when the autofocus doesn't have the input it needs to do its thing, and sometimes when I want to just be creative. So manually focus is something I do as well, and I use some of my old manual focus tricks with autofocus. Okay, for example, I'm photographing at an air show, and I know the aircraft are going to fly down the flight line at a certain distance. I will pre-focus my camera at that distance, just like I did in the days of manual focus. So the lens is already 95% where it needs to be focus-wise. Then it needs just a slight tune-up in which to actually grab the subject and pull it in sharp. Just speeds everything up, and the faster it is, everything works better. One thing to keep in mind in this whole process is real simple. When that focus in the viewfinder is not critically sharp, it's hard to operate as a photographer, and it does cause a frustration level, and everything tends to go kafooey. So the more you can do to make the autofocus system work for you, the better. So those are autofocus basics. Now these are all the ones I depend on, again, to emphasize that I use in my photography. It's up to you whether you decide you want to adopt them or not. These are just what I'm doing for the success I am achieving when it comes to sharpness. So all right, so now we got the basics. Let's get to actually applying some of the autofocus we have in our cameras to bringing that subject home. All right, so let's get to applying autofocus modes. I'm going to talk about the Z6 II and the D6. Now, there are, like I mentioned, a lot of autofocus modes inside these cameras. Now, this is being filmed in July, this video I'm doing, in July of 2021. So I'm using the current firmware as of that date for both of these bodies. And I have no doubt it will be updated as the geniuses that know how this stuff works internally make improvements for us. And these guys are smart. They do stuff that's really just making our lives really simple. So on the Z6 II, my main, as in probably the AF mode that I'm in the majority of the time. Oh, I should step back a second. A very common question about this autofocus stuff is, how often do I use autofocus? How often do I manually focus? Well, manually focus is actually decreasing, and it's probably between 80 and 90% of the time, the camera's doing the autofocus work for me. The rest of it's manual focus. It's come a long way since I first started with this autofocus stuff. So anyway, back to the Z6 II. The autofocus mode I use the vast majority of the time is auto area AF with animal eye detection. The number 2 would be the auto area AF with the human eye detection. I wish somebody would explain the difference in those for me, but I'm sure there's technical reason, but an eye is an eye, I think. But these two are on this plane, and birds are anyway. Supposition. So then number 3 for the Z6 II, the one I use is the wide area AF. Those are the 3 main autofocus modes that I use in the Z6 II, which I access by hitting the I button on the back of the body, and in the viewfinder, menu comes up. I can quickly toggle and change on the fly what autofocus mode I want to use. Now there's other settings inside the Z6 II that I depend on, or I should say the AF system depends on, to operate within the parameters in which I'm telling it autofocus area AF eye detection. So for all those kind of settings, make sure you head to my settings page on the website for your camera body, and you can see all the AF custom settings that I dial in to make things work better for at least my photography, and they might apply to yours. Now on the D6, when it comes to autofocus modes, the one I depend on the vast majority of the time anymore with the current update is the auto area AF, and then the eye detection is active via the custom settings. The second one that I use is what I call C2, and that is a group area AF, and it's a custom one that I set up. You can do the same thing. That's 3 sensors by 15 sensors in size. And that's the 2 that I use for the D6. Now when it comes to autofocus operation, the D6 to me is the animal. It's the one that knocks them all out of the park. And I can't emphasize that enough. Now keep in mind that I'm using fastest firing rate possible, so I'm shooting at continuous high. I have this camera set to AFC, and then I plug in the AF modes I need for the scenario at hand. Now, what are those scenarios? I need to help you with that. And to do that, I'm going to show you some photographs. I'm going to start off with the Z6 II using the auto area AF and the animal eye detection. Now, the one thing I haven't done for you, and I'm sorry, I just didn't get the time, is that you can actually see what you're seeing through the viewfinder. When it's active, you'll see a yellow box, and then you'll see a triangle. And the triangle will either be on the right or left side. Now, that yellow box is telling you the animal or the human eye detection system is active, and that yellow box is going to go to the eye. Those triangles, if you want, you can toggle with the multi-selector and tell the camera to either use this eye or that eye. In other words, you can prioritize the focus on one eye or the other. So if your model's like this and it's sideways to the camera, you can either tell it to lock on this eye or this eye. And the difference being, if you're shooting at 1.4, if you lock on this eye, it's very possible this eye might not be sharp. So it's giving you that option. If you're shooting with the animal, you can do the same thing, but yeah, I never have. I use the animal eye detection and it just functions. So I'm going to show you what happens after that. So with this Greater Roadrunner, if you take a look at the photograph, you can see that once the eye is locked on, the auto area AF gives you this red, just goes to working. It doesn't give you this red square. What you're seeing are screen captures from NX Studio, and you can toggle on and it will tell you what autofocus mode you're using and what sensor the camera had active at the time the picture was taken. And this is really great information. The NX Studio is free, and it's a really quick and easy way to learn how your autofocus is working. So in this case, it grabbed the eye of the Greater Roadrunner, and then you can see it is basically locked onto the same plane of focus on the flank of that Roadrunner. And then as the Roadrunner moves a tad, it grabs some more area on that breast. And that breast is basically the same film plane as the eye, so the eye is sharp. Very simple basic technique for focusing, get an eye sharp, is that bigger target, which in this case is the chest. And if you look, you can see how many sensors are actually grabbing on, which is great because that is a dynamic focusing. It's going to change as the critter moves or the subject moves. Ball deal coming in. In this case, the last shot was a Z6 II at 805.6. This is a Z6 II with the Z7200-28. Locks on, again, auto area AF, eye detection, locks on to the eagle coming in, and then as it sits there and banks, it's still locking on. I think it's interesting to watch how the sensors operate. Emphasize again, you do not see these red squares while you're shooting because they'd be kind of in the way. And then you can see how it blocks out and grabs the focus. It's a really incredible intuitive system that operates very well. And every time that you sit there and hit the back button and tell the camera to focus, it's going to go through the same thing. It's going to, if you're in animal eye detection, auto area AF, and then it's going to work and hold that subject. Now, tracking is already activated. Depending on the mode in your settings, you could also have focus tracking. You could have other things active as well. Again, go to my website to see the settings, to see all the options I have active to make it operate. Now, when I go to do my air-to-air, I'm using auto area AF again. Now, auto area AF also has closest subject priority. So you can see as it grabs onto this booker going across, it's actually grabbing the biggest or the closest part of the subject to me. Now, you might say that wingtip might be closer, but I'm telling it to grab onto that cowling by using the multi-selector, and so then it locks onto that subject. Even though it's moving back and forth from the aircraft, it locks on and takes care of that focusing operation. Now, notice in all these frames up to this point, the subject basically is all you're really seeing. There's not much more around there. That's kind of my style. It also helps the autofocus work its best, its fastest for us. So that's just, another way of doing it. And look at how the sensors grab on, makes things happen. Now I go to the D6. I have two that I like the most. I told you I use the what I call C2, the group area AF, which I customized to a 3x15 grid. You can see that now. You don't see any red squares in the center, even though they are there. They just show you the outline of the AF area you have created. That's the 3x15. And that moves up and down vertically in the frame. So I move it up and down basically where the eyes are. Again, working with closest subject priority and everything else that the magic it does, it grabs that focus, whether you're horizontal or vertical. It's going to grab that eye, lock it in. Now keep in mind, we're just talking about where we're focusing the actual elements. We're not talking about the depth of focus, which comes from your f-stop. We're talking about just the actual focusing of the camera. The other thing that I really love is the auto area AF in the D6 with the current firmware update. It's bloody brilliant. It boggles my mind what this does now, because I photographed these greater prairie chickens many times in total darkness. I've always had to manually focus. Too dark for the camera to operate. Remember, it's got to have contrast, a strong vertical diagonal line. With the latest firmware update in the D6, they kind of threw that out the window, and I don't know how they did it, but God bless them, because it works great. So with Auto Area AF, what happens is you turn it on, you'll see this little red square. And you move that square around the frame with the multi-selector. And what you're telling the camera is, this is where the subject is, follow the subject where the square is. Not that the square doesn't move, the square does move. We're just telling the camera where to start looking. And boom, it locks right on. You can see, even though the chicken moved a little bit, it's locked onto that head and that eye because the eye detection is turned on, and it's functioning. It works great. It works even better, if that's even possible, when there is contrast, a strong vertical diagonal line. It's just a brilliant system. And it's so fast. It's what gets me. No matter what the subject, the lighting conditions, sharp-tailed grouse, and what gets me is that I've told it what bird to lock onto, so it's ignoring the other one. Now there is inside both these cameras, Z6 II, D6, and other bodies, a setting that you tell the camera how quickly or how long you want to wait, however you want to look at it. The camera to change its focus if something comes between you and the focus. So in other words, with this scenario here, there could be grass that comes between myself and the subject, that grouse. Do I want the camera to instantly grab on that piece of grouse, that glass, grass, and ignore the grouse, or vice versa? So in this case, I tell it to ignore that grass and just stick onto the grouse, so I make the delay longer. If it's going to be shorter and you want it to snap real quick, you change that number. So I go back and forth between that custom setting and change it quite a bit. So it's actually in my menu because of, what could be between me and that subject, like aircraft, things like that. Now, again, Auto Area AF, I move that red square around with the D6, put it on the subject. In this case, it was this newborn lamb. It watched it, moved around, so I am not focusing. I have the back button depressed, so the system's active. It's moving the focusing around to keep track of this little guy. It works so amazing that when he's on this sheer side of a cliff, and I don't know how they do it, it just defies gravity. There's nothing there, and he's just running across. I told it where to do it and where to start, and just followed it right across. Boom, no problem. And in my air-to-air work, same thing, Auto Area AF. It just latches on, sticks with the subject I tell it to with that very first click, and then no matter the scenario, in this case I'm moving, subject's moving, it is just keeping up with the whole scene, bringing in the sharpness and the focus. Now with that said, you got to remember the basics are everything. You've got to have a stable platform, whether you're handheld or on a tripod. You got to have the AF modes that you need operational with the custom settings, fine-tuning it to your photography. And then you just have to remember that contrast, sharp or strong diagonal and vertical line, and the autofocus will perform as you expect it. If it's not working as you expect it to, at least from my point of view, I always look at myself and what I'm not doing to give the camera the right input. I'm not thinking the camera is just not working for me. So hopefully that helps you with your autofocus, making it an incredible asset to your photography so you can concentrate more on the story you want to tell rather than how you want to tell it.